the little bit of research that I've done, he's been interested in building things for a long time. He started as a young kid, putting things together, maybe in his garage or his backyard, and it led him all the way up to working on rockets. He served on many different councils for many different corporations throughout the last couple of decades, putting together projects for space business, as well as working with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. And I believe he is an alum from Utah State University. So with that little introduction, I'd like to hand it over to you. If there's anything that I missed in your story, you can start with that. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure to be here. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. It's just, it seems like Phoenix is a world away from Tucson. So it's
yeah,
tough to make it up there.
It's
a whole day thing.
True.
So question for you guys, what is it's most interesting for you to hear about tonight? I can talk about pretty much anything you want, but yeah, just want to know what you guys are looking for.
Josh, I have a lot. I have a lot for Jim. So you can start, Josh.
Yeah,
I can ask.
I have a lot
them
as
later.
well, but as an opener, I think we should discuss about your founding of Phantom Space Corporation.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so like you said, I've been in the space business a long time. That qualifies me as a human barnacle, and there are a lot of human barnacles out there, and hopefully you live till a long enough age that you can become one yourself. Yeah, I started Phantom Space almost exactly 3 years ago with my co-founder Mike D'Angelo, and he and I first met at Moon Express, which was at somebody else's company, but we were on.
So I think we lost you.
We were really the first ones out there doing it, and so Mike and I, after that experience, worked on a couple other companies, and we about 3 years ago found ourselves sort of in between things, and decided we wanted to really try and solve what we thought was the biggest problem in the space world right now, with this growing commercial number of satellites out there. And really the biggest problem in our mind is twofold. One is the cost of accessing space, and then two, the barriers to entry to get there. So there's both capital barriers and intellectual barriers. So by that I mean, it costs a lot to build a satellite, and it costs a lot to launch it. It takes a lot of time, which translates into money. So those are all your capital barriers. But the other one is a little more insidious. To build satellites, for example, is sort of a specialized bit of engineering. It's not so hard, I would say, as it is just specialized. It's kind of like somebody engineering a Ford truck versus a Formula One car. I mean, they're quite different, right? Ordinary engineering versus satellites. It's a very specialized set of experiences you need to have, and so forth. So the other part of it is there's not that many people out there that have done it, that are experienced at it or educated at it. And really the education is not enough. You have to have had the experience to understand what works and what doesn't. So it really constitutes, this small cabal of people that sometimes are very arrogant and difficult to get along with and very expensive. So we decided to start Phantom to lower those barriers for people getting ideas into space. Ultimately, the way you make money in space, the way we see it, is by creating applications that either are moving bits from one place on the globe to another, or they're transforming photons that you're measuring from orbit into decision quality information, or it's measuring other phenomenon to predict weather, those sort of things. There's probably many more applications that I'm frankly not smart enough to think of. But as you saw over the last 20 years, mobile phones have become this thing, which is the center of our existence. And that's because the applications on them grew. The mobile phones themselves were interesting, but it was the applications that grew on it and lowered the barrier for people to put their ideas for applications on a telecommunication system. So that's really what we're doing here at Phantom. And so in order to do that, what we're ending up creating is really a threefold business strategy. The first is to build what we think is the world's lowest cost launch vehicle that is small enough to be mass manufactured. And we hope to become the Henry Ford of space by applying mass manufacturing to both the launch vehicles that get the satellites up and then the satellites themselves. And if you're familiar with the Henry Ford story, he came around at a time when automobiles were $8,000 and then your dollars. That's 100 years ago or more. And they were the sort of things that only very wealthy people could afford. And the average person certainly couldn't afford it. Everybody else was either riding bicycles, walking, riding horses. And so Henry Ford came along and said, I'm going to do something called mass production, make every one of these things the same, and lower the price. And he brought the price of each car down to about $400. And in so doing, created a revolution in the way we live today. So we think that same revolution needs to happen in space. So we start with the launch vehicle, and they have to be small enough that we can mass manufacture them. The Falcon 9 that you see SpaceX fly a lot, they can't mass manufacture those. They're just too big to be practical to do that. I mean, you could in the absolute sense, but it's not a very practical proposition. And besides that, if you made a lot of them, you'd make too many for the world's satellite supply. So there's a practical limit to that. So instead, SpaceX reuses the first stage, which is pretty clever, and they get their costs down by that way. So when we build, say, 100 or 200 of these other vehicles a year, we can compete with SpaceX on a cost basis, and we can do it more often. So that's the big thing that changes there. If you're a satellite builder and operator, one of the worst things that can happen to you is having to sit around and wait for your launch for 6 months to a year, which is very common these days with what's called rideshare on these larger vehicles. So, in terms of a lot of these tech companies, they're burning $1, $2, $3 million a month. So waiting a year could be 12, 24, $36 million a year net cost to you. So that's real money. And so the frequency of flight is really important. So once we've established this launch vehicle, we then will use that money in that strategic position, because we become a very valuable company. If you succeed in building a launch vehicle, there's only like 4 private companies that have done this so far. You're generally worth over $1 billion. And so with that kind of money, you can raise other capital really at very, very reasonable rates. That's what SpaceX is doing presently. That's why they raise over $2 billion a year in equity financing. And because they're worth $125 billion, they're giving away 1 or 2% of their company a year for several $billion. So it gives you the kind of capital you can do some very big things with. So we'll use that position with this launch vehicle then to work our way into satellite constellations, where we're building other people's constellations of 50, 60, 70 satellites and launching them. And we actually have 3 contracts for constellations right now in that kind of thinking. So then the third thing is we'll build eventually our own space applications. We have one right now we're working on for the data backhaul for the connected car market. So there's probably a lot of other good ideas that'll come our way, but eventually we become a space applications company. We just happen to have the launch vehicle and the satellites and everything we need to do it. So, we've been at it for 3 years. We are right now, there's a crew of ours out in New Mexico, hot fire testing a stage. Tonight, they'll be doing the first ignition of that stage, I think. And if everything goes as planned, and we're planning to launch about a year from now, and everything looks, in order to get there. We've done this for a record low amount of money. The capital invested so far has been 20 million. We're in the process of raising about 60 million right now, and that'll take us almost to cash flow positive. As a comparison to other rocket companies of this nature, they've usually spent 100 million by now, and to get to cash flow positive, they're about a $500 million. So we're kind of an anomaly in how we've done it. And part of the reason is where we're at here in Arizona, very low cost operations. The other part, probably the more important part, is the kind of people we've recruited, and we brought in some very experienced people, some of which were in the early days of SpaceX with me, and they stayed a lot longer than I did, and learned a lot more than I did, and they've forgotten more about rockets than I'll ever know, and then some others who have experience launching a lot of rockets out of launch sites and so forth. So we've got a nice experienced crew that can do a lot of different kind of engineering, and they're cross-functional, and we can be very inexpensive there. And we've also engaged a supply chain for like the engines. They're built up in Colorado by a U.S. company there, for a very reasonable price that we couldn't build them for, and we licensed the flight computers and the software from NASA from a program that they had for $20,000. Was a hell of a deal. All these things saved us, $100-200 million. So that's where we're at. Like I said, we're here in Tucson. That's where we're headquartered. We have a launch site out in California. We're working on another one in Florida, and we have another one up in Alaska that we have for future use as well. We expect to be around for a long time, so hopefully we'll become a fixture of the Arizona economy. This is my 12th startup, so I guess I think it's my last. I'm 57 years old, and at some point you have to say enough is enough. I just had a nice exit on a satellite company I helped start about 5-6 years ago. Got sold, and I helped start a couple other companies that I'm guessing will get sold here in the next few years. So I'm starting to get to that point in my life where I'm starting to see the rewards for all of this. So, but for me, the reward wasn't so much financial as it was just doing the right thing, right? And I think you said it in the beginning. I just like to build things, and I at this point in my life, if I'm not building rockets, I like to build my race cars, and that's something I do in my spare time. So you're eating into my race car building business tonight. So it says something that I must really like you guys in order to take an hour off of fooling around with race cars to talk to you guys. I'm teasing you, by the way.
I had a question, despite the echo, about the SpaceX. I'm gonna move over there. Yeah. I had a question about, I guess, lunar land. I believe there are companies, at least there's one, like the Cosmic Register, that is focusing on selling lunar land.
Yeah.
Not dealing with states. The UN doesn't necessarily work with that, right? None of the conventions are related to what private companies do, and governments can't really regulate that because that becomes an issue, right? Where the UN says you have to negotiate and then go to the Secretary General with your confirmation. So I was wondering if you make launch costs, everything lower, if we have radiation protection technology, we have better gravity technology, we have atmospheric mimic an atmosphere for a lunar base, right, for tourism and the like. Would that create, in your mind, conflict? Would it create a financial bubble burst with the space sector if that would happen, given the way the space sector is currently structured with finance? What would the consequences be of a successful registry?
Well, I guess I would take issue with the whole registry to begin with. So if you go back to North America and both Americas and how they were settled, it's very interesting. If you dig into some of the history and this may sound sort of crazy to you guys, but there were Europeans here long before Christopher Columbus ever managed to get here. And when they would come through, there's good archaeological evidence that they were here for several hundred years before. They would set claims on the land, and they would do it in the form of stones, which were chiseled out to indicate that there was a claim for country X or country Y, and to a certain extent the Vikings were doing that. And then there's some belief there's some other Europeans that were from the Middle Ages that had done it. There's some really interesting archaeological evidence. So that's to say that North America is kind of like what it's going to be on the moon. I know we're more civilized supposedly today, and we've got this thing called the United Nations. But at the end of the day, when major stakes are up for grabbing land and so on another planet, I think the United Nations can go to hell in most people's eyes. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out, because really what it kind of comes down to historically is, what we say is possessions 9/10 of the law. And I would really look to the history of how North America was settled. You can have early land claims that people find and they're like, no worries. I mean, if you want to say that, then our Apollo missions were land claims on the moon. There's really no legal basis for anybody to do such things. And, unless we all become more civilized than we're likely to be, I don't think anybody's going to listen to, a central body at the United Nations declaring who can own and who can't own. Now, counter to my cynicism, I've been told I'm cynical, is, Antarctica. And there's a lot of land claims there that have been really dealt with at the United Nations very peacefully. So there are counter examples, but I would maintain that the interest in Antarctica is mainly scientific rather than economic. So when there's an economic interest in say space mining, I think it's going to be revolutionary. And I do think that that's out there. We know what the mineral composition of the moon is, and there's a lot of rare earth minerals that are present there that aren't as easily found on the Earth. And we all understand, the ecological cost of digging up minerals. So there's definitely a future in mining asteroids, and the moon in particular. Moon's easier to get to and so forth. And it will happen, but it's not going to happen because somebody forms a little company and says, I bought the rights to it. That's nice. But and if you can make money at it, I'd say go for it. Go make money at it. But it's not going to change the way things go. And yes, conflict will follow these claims on the moon, absolutely, without question. There's sort of a little unseen in the press for some reason, I don't understand it, contest going on between the U.S. DoD and China in cislunar space and on the moon. And it's very interesting to realize that the U.S. DoD is very, very worried about what the Chinese are doing on the moon, and vice versa. So there's a lot of behind the scenes things going on there. And anything China does in space is really de facto military. I mean, it kind of like the way it was in the early days of the Soviet Union and the U.S. So it's something to watch. I don't want to throw cold water on your ideas. I just think it's probably going to be a lot different than you think.
Yeah, who knows?
Jim, I actually had a question. It's not just a question. It's like, it's something to do with SpaceX. So I
Never
actually
heard
came
of them.
across, like, can you hear me?
Never heard of them. Yeah.
Just kidding. So when Elon Musk was asked the question, like, like, how did he come up with SpaceX? The first thing he said was like, I had actually, like, when I started SpaceX, like, I was planning to start SpaceX. I did not have that much knowledge on space. So the first thing I did was like give a call to Jim, and Jim actually gave me really good books. So I studied those books, and after that, that's when, like, that's how SpaceX began. So is that true?
Yeah. Did he actually say that?
Yeah, he actually said that.
Did you hear it, or is that secondhand?
No. He actually said that in a press interview. I literally heard
Oh,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
No, that's good, because he's tried to write me out of the history of SpaceX a few
Oh.
times. he sent lawyers my way, and I've got.
This is like at least like 5-6 years old interview. So I don't know about the current
That's good.
status, what's going on.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
I've heard this before, but I've never been able to find it. But yeah, that's actually very true. And the story, which is kind of well worn, but it's he called me out of the blue, and it was July 14th, 2001, and it was a Friday afternoon, as I recall. And he was looking for me to help him go buy Russian rockets. He already had a mission in mind. He'd been working with a guy named Bob Zubrin, who started the Mars Society, and he wrote several books on the case for Mars and so on. And Bob's a good friend of mine, and they designed this mission that Elon's goal was to inspire in humanity the idea of going to Mars as humans, which he later discovered he really didn't need to do. The inspiration was definitely there. We just didn't have the willpower and the financial means to do it the way the government does it. So at any rate, this early mission he wanted to do with Russian rockets, and so he and I went over to work with the Russian. I'd spent 6 years there and had a long history with him, and so I took him for a tour over there. And Russians really were pretty disrespectful to him, which is kind of funny when you read the news every night. Everything's about Elon. It's Elon, Elon, Elon 24/7. And here 20 some odd years ago, I took him over, and the Russians were spitting on him and calling him a little boy behind his back. And but during this whole period of time, he said, "Hey, I'd like to understand more about rockets. Do you have anything I can read?" I said, "Yeah." So I went and grabbed. I had a couple of books. One was on rocket propulsion, and the other was on astrodynamics. I got my master's degree in that stuff, and these were my textbooks from college, and I gave them to him. They were actually good books. Sutton, you can't even buy the Sutton book now. It got so popular, everybody went out and bought it, but they're like $300 now for a copy because I created a market. I should have bought all of them before I ever gave an interview on this. But at any rate, and then he took my AIAA book on launch vehicles and started reading them. I mean, the guy. They go, "Yeah, I read it," and you start asking questions. They don't know anything about it. Yeah, but Elon, I mean, he would come back with questions. I remember one time he said, I was reading Sutton's book on liquid propulsion, and he says that the pump-fed engines almost always get a higher specific impulse than pressure-fed engines. Why is that so? And I'm like, holy crap, this guy really read this stuff. So yeah, and this is kind of how he learns. And he would depend on me to bring in experts. And I'm one of these people I call myself a human barnacle, and there's a reason. It's because I know everybody in the business. And so he'd say, "Yeah, I need a guy that knows this and this and this," and I go get him, and he'd pay him consulting fees. But we would have these get-togethers principally on the weekends at these hotels and various places on the West Coast, and we'd have a set of questions, and it was like a big seminar for Elon, and that's how we learned. Jeff Bezos is the same way, by the way. So
Gotcha.
Kind of curious. He had what we called Jeff Bezos Space Friday, and in the early days, Blue Origin was so secretive we couldn't admit that we'd met him or that it existed. And I worked with him a bit in the early days after I left SpaceX. But the reason they started up was there was two guys that I'd recruited for SpaceX that Elon accused of time card fraud, and he had me fire him. And one was one of my mentors that had worked on the Saturn V. And so he went over to Bezos after Elon fired him, and they started a competitive effort. So all these companies really started from the same place and time and the same people. And so it's all a very interesting story. But Bezos, I went up and gave him a lecture on how to get to Mars. So there's this thing we call patch conics that you use to simplify the calculations to get to Mars. And so my whole lecture was that. And he kind of sat in the back. It was very dark in the room, and he was in the shadow. I knew he's there. I could see his silhouette, but I don't know if you guys have ever seen that movie True Lies, where Arnold Schwarzenegger sits in the back impersonating a Frenchman while his wife strips. And that's exactly the scene. That's the way it looked to me from standing up there, briefing him, So these guys are all, they're all kind of curious intellectually. These billionaire guys I've discovered, Richard Branson, I know as well. And also very bright. He's not nearly as technical as those two, but very bright guy.
Sweet. So,
Sorry, TJ, I have another question.
yeah, Miles has a question.
That kind of based off this one. So you mentioned like that in your business experience, there was a bit of, would you say that to create a really solid company, that if anybody in the SBA or on here now were to work together with a team, that we should at all costs attempt to prevent with the golden mechanism or anything, any sort of negative impact toward any company we create? Or would you say that a team, focusing on the team above all, would be a smarter way of ensuring sustainability in business?
When you say negative impact, are you talking about a societally negative impact, or?
It's a business, because you mentioned that there was a bit of a power grab, and so
yeah,
what would you recommend for anyone learning to recognize you so as to prevent it from happening in their organization to ensure business sustainability?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, any lasting startup, and they're fragile. I mean, they're like a snowball on a summer's day. You have to really care for them, because every force in the world is going to want to destroy them. And the core of that is your team, and primarily your founding team. And boy, have I made mistakes there. So, it's like I've been divorced once, and if you want to talk to me about, what not to do to make mistakes in your life, I probably made every mistake you could make in my life. So, but you learn from them. And the one I learned big time when I've had founder problems, and every company I've started has a little bit of founder problems, and you have to be willing to, to adjust as you go. But you've got to just be really aligned on what your goals and visions are for the company, but more importantly, aligned on values. And I don't mean, political values. I mean core values about what's right and wrong, what's good to do and what's not good to do, what's meaningful to you and what's not. Maybe that's embodied by politics, but we're too divided in this society by this thing we call politics. And we don't look past that to see that we have a lot more in common with a lot of people, despite how they vote, right? So that's really the big success for me, has been able to find people and that I call builders, makers, and doers. And so that's like the core of my value system, is building something. And when you build something, you create value, and it's a tangible value that you can look, taste, smell, see, feel, touch, all those things. And it's a satisfaction within itself that you get, that if you don't get that, you're not going to understand, and you're not going to value, the process of creating something and recognize how that contributes to your ultimate success. So you've got to figure out what that is. That's the filter for those people being, in fact, in many ways closer to you than your spouse. In some ways, it's harder to get along with a co-founder than it is a spouse. I can tell you that for a fact. A divorce from a spouse is a lot less messy than a divorce from a co-founder at times. Although, I have gotten rid of co-founders, and you have to be willing to do that when it happens. And as the CEO, and I've always really been the CEO most of the time in the co-founder status, and the dictatorial sort of approach to these things doesn't work very well. Decisions by committee don't work either, but you have to be very sure, and everybody else has to be perfectly aligned with you on this, So one of the things we use all the way down, into our engineering staff as a filter at Phantom is Arizona. Okay, so that might sound strange to you. I'm not a native of Arizona. I came from California, and I've lived all over the place, Utah and Florida, Europe. But, Arizona has a certain sort of something to it that I can't quite describe that seems to only attract certain styles of people that really love it here, right? There's a lot of people that live here that don't love it. But those that love it here, that are willing to relocate here, they tend to be sort of individual, rugged, individualist kind of characters. They tend to value being makers, doers, and they tend to not be the sort of people that value things that I don't find important. So we find that when we go to hire people and they don't want to move to Arizona, we don't push it, because 9 times out of 10 they're not going to fit in. They just literally have a different value structure than we do, and it's something that living in this desert really brings to the fore. If you're living in California, it's a whole lot easier to sort of ignore a lot of things like that, because if you're on the beach, it's a very pleasant place to live. But Arizona, you either love it or you hate it. It's kind of the way I've found. So that's, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sweet. I have one more question, but it's not something to do with space, but it has something to do with your passion. And I actually followed a lot about Jim, that Jim loves racing cars and like making cars. And I think also Jim mentioned today that he loves making cars. So what's how did that become your passion, and did you learn something from it? Because I think like you have never stopped racing, like even right now, like you still pursue that as a pure passion. So did you learn something from that, and also did it help some way build up your space related companies, and you got networks from your racing group? Yeah, just a quick
Okay.
on that.
No, that's good. There's a number of questions in there. So why do I have the passion? I honestly don't know. I was born with it. And I can tell you that honestly. Every time you see a picture, of me when I'm, say, 2-3 years old, I always have a car in my hand, a toy car. And from the earliest times, I had little, what they call big wheels. They were little trikes that you could pedal around. And all I can ever remember wanting to be in my life was a race car driver. That's the only thing I've ever known for absolute certainty that I wanted to do in life. And it started when I was very young and has never, ever left me. I took a break, for 15 years when I moved to Europe for my first real job over in France. And then I had kids, and, you'll find out, those of you who aren't parents, that it becomes a more than full-time job. And so once things, sort of lightened up there, I got a divorce and went racing again. So it was more important to me to be racing than it was to be married to the woman I was married to. She hated it. So it was time to get rid of her. And the second woman I married loves it. So it's compatible there. But, it just is for me. So, and I struggle with this with my kids. I have 6 kids, and some of them clearly have found their passion. Some of them have not. And boy, I just don't know how to advise people that haven't found it. I actually feel bad for them, because without it, life is really tough. I don't know how you decide to put your energy into something without having that passion, because it's the thing that gets me up in the morning. And there's some days where life really sucks. It sometimes is just not okay. You lose perspective. And life is wonderful. When you've come close to losing it, you start to realize that. But that's not how you see it every day, right? And without passion, it's really, really hard to get up, and it's hard to be successful too, I think, without being passionate about what you're doing. So the question then becomes, has this helped me in space? I think it's actually made me better at what I do in space, because I spend a lot of time building, and most people wouldn't expect it, being a CEO type, but I know how to weld, I know how to run the milling machines and the lathes, and and I'm an expert sheet metal guy and body and paint. I painted lots of cars, and I rebuild engines, and I drive the cars. So there's pretty much nothing I can't do on the car, and that's made me a much better engineer. Engineering school was in a lot of ways a waste of my time. I had to have the certificates. The only thing I really learned there was a lot of this esoteric space stuff about, how you control satellites and, that sort of earlier sort of specialized knowledge that was hard to learn otherwise. But, as far as like building machines, it's all the same. And, when you walk up to a machine and you're experienced at building it, when they're done well. You just know it. And that's the kind of skill I ended up having. So, to your question of, what have I learned from it? I actually, my second book is called The 5 Things I Learned from Racing and How It Applies to Entrepreneurs. And so there's actually more than 5 things in there as I've written it. But, I go through certain things we learn in racing, like don't ever give up. If you spin in a corner, you can cry to yourself and feel sorry for yourself, but you can dust yourself off and put your pride in your pocket and get back in the race. You still can win. You might think, well, I've lost the race. That's not necessarily true. Same is true for entrepreneurs, so on and on and on. There's just all these lessons that you learn from the experience of racing and preparing and dealing with defeat and being a little gracious in your success and so forth that really apply.
Sweet. So we actually have a lot of questions from club members. So first, I would like to have Aman. Aman.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. It's a really great honor to meet you over here. My question is more related to your life. Like, how did you imagine, like, in the journey you were an engineer, and then over the years have become such a great entrepreneur? Like, that's something I share my mindset with you, like about building stuff, having a building mindset. So I share something very similar. But right now, when I'm doing my grad course in aerospace, I just feel that sometimes, like, how would I picture myself to be an entrepreneur at the same time being an extraordinary person in the skill sets at the technical level too? So how did you manage those two things along your journey?
Well, I never saw myself as an entrepreneur, to be honest with you, until a little bit later in my career. And it was kind of you'll find this very strange, this story, but, my first job was French Space Agency, well, NASA, and then French Space Agency. And, space back then was in all defense was really a nation state kind of activity, and necessarily slow and sometimes very boring and often frustrating. And, it was when I came back to the U.S. in the mid '90s, my wife decided to start a curbside recycling program in the city we lived in, because back then they didn't do that sort of thing. And she got in trouble. She didn't really know how to run a business, and so I had to jump in and help. And it was then I discovered, much to my chagrin, of having made fun of business students in college. I mean, I don't know how it is now. I'm guessing it's no different, that we always made fun of business students and how easy their courses were. As engineers, we were way too proud of ourselves, right? And way too impressed with how difficult our education was, to a fault, I discovered. And I discovered that actually running a business was hard. And it was probably a lot harder than any engineering problem I'd ever faced. And, it wasn't a big business. I don't know. I think we grossed maybe $250,000 a year, $500,000, something like that. But, how do we capitalize? It was a capital intensive business. I built a lot of the equipment, and then I got involved in running it and dealing with, how do you plan the routes? And that was before we had good route planning software. And, so I was applying technical solutions I knew about to these basic problems. And then you had the problem of dealing with people, which was the hardest, right? And I mean, it's a little off color, but one time I came in late at night. I'd been traveling for my other job, and because I was doing this on the side, right, after hours, and I found the lights on in the warehouse. I stopped in, and two of the employees were having sex in the cardboard, right? What do you do with that? You're like, you got to be kidding me. they're the only ones there, fortunately. But still, you're like, nobody ever prepared me for this. And of course, I fired them. But you got to go hire more people. Do you really have to tell them that that's not allowed, right? And I fired another person for stealing, and then they turned me in, for unemployment insurance, and I fought him and said, no, I fired him for cause, and I had to go through this whole unemployment court thing, and they said, oh yeah, no, you're supposed to put in your employee handbooks that you have to, the stealing is a terminable offense. It's like, okay, so you learn all this stuff at sort of that level, and then as I got going, more and more I got critical of the company I worked for, and I when I criticized them, they put me into management. So I I should have shut up, but I ended up running sales for this company, and they could barely get about 20 million a year in revenues. And when I got done with it, I grew it to like 75 million in about 3 years. And then they told me they didn't want me in that position anymore because I was getting too much business, right? So that's about the point that Elon called me, and we went off and did SpaceX. So it's just been this sort of cascading of experiences. Now, as I look back, I really wish I'd have gotten a business degree in addition to my engineering, and understood all the things that I had to learn on the street. Finance I had to learn on my own. I do very big deals, $100 million finance deals, but I understand it now, and because I'm smart and I read and things like that. But I could have used that, So you guys that are thinking like this, don't be so critical if you're engineers of business people and business classes. That stuff's hard. It's really hard. And as a bigger sort of lesson in life, don't be so sanctimonious about other people that you think are not nearly as smart as you, because chances are you're wrong, right? I mean, this stuff, life has a way of just slapping you in the face.
Awesome. So
Awesome.
next we
Thank you
have
so much.
Vishnu. Next we have Vishnu.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hey,
Yes.
Hi, I'm Vishnu, and my question is related to SpaceX. So SpaceX has plans to colonize Mars and go beyond Mars, right? And for that, for a spaceship or space mission to be self-sufficient, food is very primal and very important. How
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat that because somehow my audio went away when you started asking the question.
my question is related to SpaceX. SpaceX plans to colonize Mars and go beyond Mars, right?
Correct.
And to do that, for any spaceship or space mission to be self-sufficient, food or plants are really important. They're very primal to human beings. How do SpaceX plan to do those experiments in space right now? I mean, there's no experiments on plants are very limited right now. How do SpaceX plan to do all those things?
Well, I don't know. And I would say we don't know whether or not they actually plan to, or if they've done experiments, or what they're actually thinking. This is a classically very secretive part of SpaceX. I can tell you in the early days, this I know for sure because I was there and I saw it with my own eyes. We would tell people that we were building rockets, but Elon's real goal was to someday go to Mars with SpaceX. And so that's clearly their corporate goal. And my friends who I recruited to SpaceX that stayed 10 years longer than me tell me that without a doubt that continued to grow in importance with time. So I'm very convinced that their goal, their ultimate objective is that. And if you look at Starship, I think that's only aimed at Mars. And you look at things like the Boring Company, and you think, well, he's going to solve traffic problems. I actually disagree. I think he's going to bore holes in Mars, and that's where we're going to all live, on Mars. When not me, I'm not going, but that's where people would live. So as far as the food, that's a really great question, and I think it has to be a sustainable sort of capability, like the Martian. So Andy Weir, who wrote that book originally, was one of us. He's one of us lunatics who, were involved in these early entrepreneurial Mars efforts. And, he got it right on that movie. I think that's how you do it. And, the soil is capable of withstanding plant growth. That was one of the things we were going to do for not SpaceX, but the Musk Foundation on the Mars Oasis mission, was to grow basically weeds on Mars in an artificial soil with Martian CO2. So the elements are there. You just need the water. And that's why, you go back to Starship, you look at Starship, and it's very interesting. So it's 100 metric tons per launch if it meets its performance goals, which no reason to suspect it won't. And last year, 700 metric tons of satellites went into orbit worldwide. 700 metric tons. That means 7 launches of Starship would launch everybody's stuff. And so all this bull crap that you hear people saying, well, they're going to launch Starship for $10 million a piece, and da, da, da. There's no way on God's green earth that Elon spent $10-20 billion to develop this rocket, and where he's going to turn a $20 billion a year industry into a $70 million a year industry. That thing is meant to transport massive amounts of supplies, water, people, construction equipment, boring machines to Mars. That's the only thing that stands to reason that they built this machine, because if you want to look at it another way, there aren't enough satellites out there that are going to be built that would keep this thing occupied. So he has to be looking at sending massive amounts of fuels and chemicals and all sorts of other things. So if I were doing it, it's exactly what I would do. I'd send a boring machine up there that they're probably working on. And in fact, the guy that took over the boring machine company is a friend of mine, and he's an aerospace engineer, and he called me, asked me whether I thought he should take the job. And I told him, because he didn't know, I said, I think it's all about going to Mars. And I've never heard back from him. So I suspect I'm right on that. But I'd send a boring machine up there and start, digging holes in the ground. And, then you can find out really what's under there and have a nice place where you can hide from radiation and build underground cities. And then I start sending fuel supplies and chemistry and other machinery and power generating systems, solar panels. I'd send special Mars Teslas, all that stuff. You just start collecting a big camp of stuff up there before you send people. So, again, I go back to The Martian as probably the great model for how that was really, really accurate, I thought, on every aspect of it. Every single aspect of that movie was engineering wise accurate. So I know I didn't answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
Awesome. Next we have Tim. Sorry, Vishnu, do you have a second question?
Yeah. One last question. Since you're a big racing fan, who's your pick, Max or Lewis?
Max, of course.
Thank you, Vishnu. Thank you so much. Next we have our own VP, Tim. Yeah, you're next.
I'm actually going to pass it off to Lucas first.
Okay, sweet. Come on, Lucas.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have a question I always ask anybody that comes to talk that sometimes it's more interesting answer than others, but I hope that you got an interesting one. Is what is something, so you mentioned like when you criticized the company, that was when they promoted you the most into like management and everything. What are some other similar things that aren't intuitive, that you wouldn't expect to happen, but you kind of just have learned? And like what are things that you wish people ask questions about when you come to things like this that no one ever does?
Those are some great questions, actually. Yeah, I mean, so the people aspect is always the tough one, right? And people are, if you want to think of it from an engineering point of view, people are the most complicated in a machine that you can work with, so it's no surprise there. And so I'm always constantly surprised by the sort of things people do, and how should I put this? The sort of costumes people will wear when they want to ingratiate themselves with you. And I'm here to tell you, the more money you make and the more success you're perceived to have, the more those people come around and the more sophisticated they get. They are really good at hiding their real desires, and they're really good at fooling you. And I am constantly just, but I'm still constantly besieged by these kind of people. So when you look at Elon and people like that in this optic, you begin to understand why they won't answer questions, right? I mean, he won't even talk to me anymore, and I'm like an old friend, I guess. But you know, they can't trust 99.99% of the population because the wolves hide among the sheep, and you can't tell the difference. And that is always anti-intuitive to me. I would think that we'd get good enough to find that, but the ability of humans to really get around that is just stunning to me. And then the other thing I find kind of funny and always a surprise, because maybe it's so easy for me, but the art of selling is so straightforward, but most people don't have the first clue about how to do it. And it blows me away. I wish more people, this kind of goes against what I was just saying, by the way, because those are the ultimate salespeople. But I'm talking about, just basic sales for business and stuff. If more people did that, more businesses would do a whole lot better. And that's a really underappreciated capability in our society. It's often criticized, as oh, you're just a salesman, you're a slimy salesman, you're a used car salesman, on and on and on. Sales is actually in my view of the world, it's a very noble service. When I get on Google, for example, I have this medical condition I've been researching, and I got on Google the other day, and there's a new medication that is designed to treat this very rare thing.
Yeah.
That and say, well, da 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 da. But frankly, this helps me, and so I.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. It seems like you cut out for a second. Do you mind repeating that last point?
Let's see.
Honestly, I wish people would ask me less about the story when Elon calls me on the phone. So you didn't ask me that. Thank you. I'm getting really tired of that one. But what I wish people would ask more about is what somebody asked about earlier, which is passion. I think that particularly for your generation. I mean, you guys are same age as my youngest kids, and I think that's a challenge more for your generation than it was for mine, because there's so many more things coming at you. I mean, the information revolution we call the internet came about. It came about slowly, but one day it dawned on me that there's so much more information available to all of us now. It's almost hard to choose. The Europeans that I lived with in France used to tell me that the thing they were most bothered about by America was going shopping in the store and having too many things to choose from. If they wanted, a certain meat, they just wanted that. They didn't want 9 different types of meat. Coffee, there's just coffee. There's not 20 different flavors of it. You go into Starbucks and you listen to this whole chatter of, oh, macchiato, this, that, venti. You're just like, what the hell? Just give me coffee, right? And so it was easier for us to find things that we're passionate about. And there's just so much noise that more. And I wish they would be able to find it more, because it's so fundamental to your basic happiness and also to your success. So those are the things.
Awesome. I'm gonna pick it up from here. So we are running short on time, so I will let you get back to your race car. Very, very soon. I really want to thank you for talking for your time, and I'm blown away that all your success and expertise, both in the engineering side of things and in the business world, and as a business leader and consultant, and all these things, that passion, intellectual curiosity, and values are things that you see as being the difference maker. As a person, as a businessman, businesswoman, whatever in life, it seems like it boils down to these things.
It does.
So I guess I want to thank you for that. And just one last question, I guess, before you get out of here. Do you have any advice for the people sitting here in this room? We're college students. We do come from some different backgrounds and different countries and have different interests and stuff like that. But this interest in space is one of those things that passions us. So we do have that in common, and we are in college. So for us young people that do have this passion, I don't know, could you leave us with something, as aspiring professionals, space professionals, as aspiring just mature adults? You can take that any direction, but that
sure. Well, yeah, let me attack this from two different angles. So my first book, which is at the publishers, will be out. It's called Breaking All the Rules. One of the things that formed the way I wrote the book was, surprisingly for me, was a huge number of students from the third world who reached out to me on places like LinkedIn, mostly, somewhat on Facebook, and they were born into not as fortunate circumstances as we have here. Some would say maybe it's more fortunate than the developed world. All right, I'll leave that for another debate. But born into less opportunity in their worlds, and they resonated with my story, which is I was born in a blue collar family in Southern California, and my dad delivered uniforms. My mother managed a nursing home, and we didn't have two nickels to rub together when I was a kid, and it was a chicken ranch, and that's the environment I came from, and I pulled myself up on my own bootstraps. I paid for my college by working as a Ford mechanic, and there was no silver spoon in my mouth. So there's been a lot of people in the third world that sort of resonate with this idea that you can become anything you want to become. And I really want you guys to hear that. And some of you have probably come from privilege, some of you have not, and some of you, I hear the accents, have come from some of these countries I'm talking about, and that's all awesome. And I think that you guys need to understand that whatever you set your mind to do, you become your own limitation. And don't limit yourself, because we often are our own limitation, right? So with that, then, with respect to the space business, I think it's helpful to think of the space business right now as being akin to what the New World was, 500 years ago when Columbus first set foot here. It was a place where we knew there was opportunity, but it was so far away, most people couldn't grasp what it was or what we would do there that would ever create value. Yet I can argue that the Americas have been one of the greatest creations of value in all the recent history of mankind taken together. And I think space has got that kind of capability, got that kind of potential. And it's really in its very infancy right now. And it's never too late to join. But, if you do get involved, I've seen an amazing ride in my life where we went from me watching the first man step on the moon when I was a child to now, regular commerce in space. And I'll not have seen a tenth of what you guys will see in your life that way. So So if you want to get in the space industry, you're at the ground floor, and guys like me, we're just going to hand the baton off to you. And I'm